down the line view, and you record both, and now you have both swings recorded at the same time.
That's a very clever idea.
Ah.
You can do it down the line at the same time as the face off. Cool.
Yeah, because you can do the automatic voice, so it recognizes when it swings. So it then record with the iPhone on the back, down the line, and the iPhone on the front, and boom, when it uploads, you have both swings in your system.
That's a very clever tip. We'll have to give people that tip.
Yeah.
All
All
right.
right. Shall we get started?
Yeah, I'm gonna remove myself.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Paul Park. I am VP of Business Ops at Sportsbox. Just wanted to welcome and thank you, everyone, for joining this webinar today. We have the privilege today to learn about how ground reaction forces help create movement in golf swings. And joining us today are two of the highest distinguished biomechanists that need no introduction. Dr. Phil Cheetham, our Chief Science Officer at Sportsbox, as well as Dr. Mike Duffey, one of the world leaders in the field of golf biomechanics, and also owner of a biomechanics consulting firm, Spheres Consulting. Our speakers today, they've dedicated their careers to exploring, the intricate biomechanics of the golf swing. And through this webinar today, we'll be gaining valuable insights into various aspects of ground reaction forces and how you can use Sportsbox as a proxy for this force data. And before I hand it off to Dr. Phil and Dr. Mike, I just want to quickly touch upon what we do here at Sportsbox and a few app updates. At Sportsbox, we're all about you can't improve what you don't measure, and we strive to provide the best and complete set of tools for all coaches and players to improve not only their students, but their own games. And so let me share my screen and show you the app. Let's see if I can do this on my phone. Can you see that okay? Cool. So we have some exciting updates on the Sportsbox app, but I just wanted to go over some main features of the app. So you take regular two-dimensional video, convert it into a 3D avatar with 3D data here. So as you play through the swing, you have your trackers and your indicators that you can turn on, the ones that you want to measure. And one of the cool features that we have is when you click on one of the trackers, it defines exactly what it is measuring. And we have these Tor ranges. So this tracks the pelvis sway at address, backswing club horizontal, top of the swing, downswing club horizontal, impact. And this is one of my swings. And one of the things that I've been working on with my coach is the pelvis sway at impact. So I have a tendency of hanging back. So my pelvis sway previously at impact was around 0.5 to 1. I really hang back on my trail side. And so one of the features that my coach was using is this watch list feature. So you see the bullseye on the top left. So when you click on that, you can create these goal ranges for your students. So this, my coach, he set one up for pelvis sway. So this is just a very specific goal range for me to be working on. And so once you set that, whenever I upload or record a swing within the app and I press this watch list item, you click on it, you don't need to scroll to that position. You could just click on it and it'll automatically shift to that position. And it shows that I was within the range of 3.5 inches to 6 inches at 5. And so just a great way to kind of validate and keep track of your students' progress. And on the student side, on my side, I immediately know if I've been doing it correctly or not. One of the really exciting updates that we just released is down the line. So let me see. So before we could only capture and measure in 3D for face-on capture, but now we can import and record in the app with the down the line. And with the down the line, it opens up new trackers and indicators. And so some of the trackers and indicators that we've released are the shaft angle. So measuring, let's say in transition, how much your club is shallowing. So that would be defined by the shaft DTL differential. And so, for instance, if we take a look at Lydia at backswing club vertical, her shaft angle is 38 degrees. And then on the downswing, she shallows it out nicely at 42.6. And so the differential there is 4.6 degrees. And another tracker and indicator that was highly requested were thrust numbers. So you have the pelvis, chest, head, mid hands, and the club head thrust numbers here. And one of the ones that I really like to look at for my own swing is the club head thrust numbers at impact. So generally, if it's too positive, you'll see that it's a heel hit, too negative, a toe hit. You have these different indicators at different positions of the swing. Second here. Okay. Let me share my screen again here on the computer. Can you see that okay? Yeah. Yeah, and so those are the basic updates on Sportsbox. And if you'd like more information, you can book a demo with Edwin Fu on our team. And also for all of our webinar attendees today, we're giving out special pricing for $800 for the Pro Premium. You can just use this code Premium 800 for 50% off. Dr. Phil, would you like to share your screen and
Yep, I'll get going. Yeah, I think you have to unshare your screen.
Yes. There we go. And also I wanted to mention we're going to reserve 10 minutes at the end for any questions. And in the meantime, if you do have any questions, please leave it in the chat.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Not muted, I hope.
Yep.
So we're going to do this. Mike and I are going to be working interactively back and forth. So we're going to be sharing our screen. So just ahead of that, please allow us a little bit of time to get that done. We did a practice this morning, but who knows what's going to happen. I think we'll be okay though. We're going to talk about ground forces. Mike's going to talk about that. And I'm going to talk about the motion or the kinematics. So just a couple of definitions to get going. Some of these you'll know, but I think there'll be a couple that'll be very helpful. And biomechanics is what we do. And biomechanics is the study of human motion using the principles of math, geometry, physics, engineering, and anatomy to measure the motion. In sports, we use biomechanics to provide a rationale as to why we teach specific techniques. If you can't rationalize it with biomechanics and physics, then you probably shouldn't be teaching that particular technique. So two goals of biomechanics are one, to rapidly improve performance, and then also help reduce injury. But biomechanics can also help with equipment design as well. So now there's two main fields in biomechanics, two main groups, if you like, kinematics and kinetics. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to be talking about kinematics, and Mike is going to be talking about kinetics. Kinematics is motion. It's the motion of objects or bodies without concern to the forces or torques that produce the motion. So it's what the motion looks like. Kinetics, on the other hand, is the forces. And it's the forces and interactions that produce or affect motion. It includes both internal and external forces. So kinetics does include the muscle forces, but today we're going to look at the external forces, that is to say, the ground reaction forces. One more definition. These are kind of home-rolled definitions that we created at Sportsbox. Trackers is one we use a lot, and that's a measurement of swing parameter throughout the swing. So a tracker has a value at every key frame. You could think of a tracker as that entire red curve or that red signature. So you could click on any one of those points in the swing and get a value. So pelvis turn, chest sway, pelvis turn speed, any of the parameters that are measured by Sportsbox, generally you can see them at any point in the swing. However, we've also built indicators, which are important key performance indicators, like their name says. We've abbreviated it just to indicators. So it's a single metric, a single value, like chest sway at impact or pelvis turn at max. So anything that's at a particular point in the swing or is computed from other trackers, it's a single number. Like, for example, it could be computed, it could be risk gain factor, which, for example, is shaft swing speed divided by arm swing speed, and it comes out with a simple, perhaps 1.3, or actually in risk gain factor, it's going to be more like the 2.3. Yeah, a couple more definitions, and we're going to talk specifically about this. Body positions are sway, thrust, and lift. Sway is side to side along a side to side axis. So you can have sway of your pelvis, you can have sway of your chest. It's toward and away from the target. Thrust, which is our new one, is along the front back axis. So you can think of it kind of towards and away from the ball. We call that forward and backward. Lift is an easy one. That's just up and down along a vertical axis. So drop and lift, we call that. And they're measured in inches, centimeters probably coming as well. So the other 3 degrees, that was the first 3 degrees of freedom of what we call 6 degrees of freedom. And the second 3 degrees of freedom are the body angles: bend, side bend, and turn. Bend is around a side-to-side axis, so it's kind of like forward tilt, if you like. Forward tilt or forward bend of your chest, forward bend of your pelvis, and it's just simply forward and backwards. By the way, these are measured in degrees because they're angles. So side bend, you could think of side tilt. It's around a front to back axis. as if you had a spear or a laser shooting through from your chest. You'd be rotating side to side around that axis. Excuse me. Turn is around an up-down axis. Now, all of these axes, though, move with your body. So the turn axis, for example, of your chest would not be perfectly vertical if you're bending forward at a rest. It's around an up-down axis, or we would call it superior inferior in medical terminology, and it moves with your chest. And as I said, they're measured in degrees. So now I'm going to head off into doing kinematics and kinetics, and we're going to look at the association with lift, sway, thrust, and turn specifically in the next few minutes. So firstly, I'll give you some background of the kinematics, and Dr. Mike will relate that and show you how the two interact with each other. He'll tell you, and I'll steal his thunder a little bit, he'll tell you, of course, that forces generate motion. So we looking at motion on Sportsbox, we do not do kinetics at this point in time. We're looking at motion. And so we see the result of what the forces are generating. But that still gives you a picture of what's happening. And you can kind of interpret backwards as to say, oh, I saw that motion. He must have been doing this to the ground. And once you get clever at it, then you can do that. So let's look at pelvis lift. And I'll look at the graph, or I'd rather think that graphs are, let me get a pointer here just a second. Is that going to work? Oh no, I'll get the laser pointer. It's a little bit bigger. Okay. So I like to look at graphs, and I call them signatures of motion because they show you the pattern of the human motion throughout the entire swing. So you can see, looking at this graph, positive, or this way is up and this way is down, which is nice because up is up and down is down on this particular graph. Makes it easy. And so you can see midway in the backswing, by the way, from address to top is the backswing, the golfer starts to move down, so the pelvis is dropping. And you can see just before the top of the backswing, it drops a little bit more rapidly, and then it continues to drop into the downswing. And then just before impact here, later into the downswing, it actually rises rapidly. So your pelvis rises rapidly. So Mike's going to explain how that happens and why that happens. You know, is it the lead knee? Is it the lead hip? What is causing that? And how does it look on the force platform? And so you see it reaches a max. And we like to talk about this pelvis, this drop lift differential. And we call it lift into impact because you're lifting into impact. And that's a really good indicator, or should I say it's correlated with club head speed. So if you have this characteristic and you do this characteristic well, it helps increase the speed of the club release. Now there's quite a few numbers over here. I'm not going to go through every one, but it does show you approximately where the pelvis is at these key positions in the backswing. And it shows you the difference between women and men. And this is not the webinar to discuss each single one of these. We have done in the past, and you can certainly review them later on the video for sure. But again, the key position, the key point here, in the next slide, is that we have this lift into impact. And so what we've done here is we've taken the downswing max, which is this point here, and we've taken the point at impact, subtracted or got the differential between the two, and we have lift into impact. So we see that for tour players, they've got about a 1.7, let's just round it up and say they've got about a 2-inch lift into impact. But you can see several variations here. The first variation is what we call a lead leg buckle. This is where at impact, the person drops, but never, in the downswing, the person drops, but never gets back up to where they were at impact. And then they just kind of stop and buckle in that spot, and then later on lift a little bit. So this is very inefficient. They're only lifting about 1 inch. And notice the slope of that curve too. It's a very low slope, and that slope is proportional to the speed that they're lifting with. So they're lifting slowly and they're not lifting very much at all. So they're not posting very well on that lead lift. Now here, down here, we've got what we like to call a jumper. And this is indicative of long drive golfers. Here we have a very good drop, a very large lift, and a very rapid lift. And in this case, the lift into impact is about 5 inches. So you can see that this is a generator of clubhead speed, and Mike will address it and show you how this occurs or how it manifests itself in the force plate and in the ground reaction forces. So with that, I'm going to try and switch screens now. If I can find out where is, 1 second, my screen's disappeared. Not going to let me go. Hang on. There we go. Get rid of that. And go to Zoom. Okay. All right, Mike, take over the sharing.
There we go. Phil, you can see my screen and hear me okay, right?
Yep.
Okay. So the overall introduction was great. In fact, that last the last graph that Phil just showed of somebody who has a lot of lift or lower and lift, people get called a squat and spring or a jumper. This golfer actually is one of those. So it was a great lead into what I want to talk about. We'll start with just a little bit of fun. Some of you may have seen this video before, but this is our explanation of Newton's first law, which is if you start with zero velocity, if you want to increase that velocity or move from that position, you need an outside force to be involved. So we've got our astronaut here, who the only outside force you can see is trying to swim against the air, which is a very difficult way to move around and an impossible way to make a golf swing. So I show this for fun, and so that's the scientific intro to why we want to use the golf swing, or sorry, the ground in the golf swing. So, all right, specifically, we're talking about pelvis lift, and so and I'm going to show some examples from what would be our lab collection setup here, which has this is the version where we put markers on the whole body, and we have a pair of force plates built into the ground so we can measure 3D forces. It's a great system to have, but the reality is that most of the time out on a range, this kind of information is not available. But Sportsbox is something that you can take outside and get quick video. So as Phil mentioned, what we're going to talk about is the relationship between the ground forces that someone's creating and how we get to see physically in the swing whether or not some of those things are going on. So I'm going to start with a quick explanation of what you're going to see here today. So the two force plates, and I use primarily the gas system for collection, so you'll see their name on here. Each foot pushes against the ground. And what I'm going to show today are the ground reaction forces. So we have a lead foot, or this golfer's a left foot force. We have a trail foot, and then the yellow arrow in the middle, that is the combined ground reaction force. It is a representation of the combination of the right and left foot forces together. So the golfer is not actually applying force down here between the feet. This yellow arrow is simply right foot plus left foot. And it shows both the magnitude. So as one gets bigger, the combined force gets bigger, and also shows direction. So if this golfer is pushing sideways, you can see that that arrow tilts over to the side. And I'll explain a little bit more about the spinning wheel in a minute, but I want to show just at relatively slow speed the ground forces during a swing. And I'll play it through with the skeleton on, and then I'll switch the skeleton off. There we go. So you can see the ground forces are changing all the time. And that is the underneath key to a good golf swing. And the key is putting it together into the movements that we can see to deliver the club in the right location, right orientation, and with good velocity. So topic number one is pelvis lift. And you'll see this blue dot in the middle here. That happens to be the center of mass. For folks that are familiar with that, that is the mass of the right arm and the left arm and right leg and left leg and torso and pelvis. It all gets added up, and it indicates where the center of all the body parts by weight are. And so in the backswing, as the arms shift to the trail side, that location actually shifts to the trail side as well. It's not a fixed location of the body. As the arms go up, that center of mass location moves up a little bit because some of the mass is moving up. So regular video doesn't show center of mass, obviously, but the pelvis and the center of mass for most of the golf swing actually move together really well. So in my mind, scientifically, I like using the center of mass, but if I have video to work with, I'll just take a look at the pelvis and say, all right, that's a good indicator of, as you're going to see in this view, the up and down and the side to side forces. So for a golf swing, we want a lot of rotation and a little bit of linear motion. The key portion of linear motions in the golf swing, for the most part, is to put the body into a good position to deliver the club. The vast majority of the velocity that's created in a golf swing is through rotation. So my only reason for bringing that up is what you're going to see is that some of these linear motions like pelvis lift can actually be an indicator for is this person creating the right kind of rotational forces. So I'll switch over to here. So in this view, in the downswing, the club's going to go, as we're looking at it, counterclockwise. So we want to create velocity in that direction, and we'd love to have that velocity be 100, 120 miles an hour, higher for some golfers. And just like turning, if we had a wrench attached to the center of the body, if we push right through the center of the body or right through the center of, say, a doorknob, it doesn't rotate, it moves in a straight line. So we want to push off to the side. You can see as we increase one side, that yellow arrow moves away from the center of mass. What we're doing is increasing the torque, or as I said, the rotational force. That is what's going to create rotational acceleration. That's what's going to create downward swing speed. So, and I kind of gave away what we're going to do here. So lifting the pelvis straight up doesn't have a lot of effect on the golf swing. The key is to apply forces in the correct way. So, in short, the key version of that is for the downswing, we want an increase, and a pretty substantial increase, in vertical force on the lead side. That gets this force out here, it creates a torque, and it creates lots of downswing velocity. What we don't necessarily want is both legs to push a lot. Hopefully you can see this. When both of them push a lot equally, it still increases the size of the vertical force, and it would increase pelvis lift. That'll make the body want to go up. But whether you can see the speed of the circle here, just the number at the top, when both push equally, it creates almost no torque, almost no rotational acceleration. So for downswing velocity, we want a low trail foot velocity, or sorry, force, and a high lead foot force. Sorry about that. I'm trying to get to pelvis velocity. So the pelvis will lift whether you're pushing right side or left side. The key to creating the rotation is to make sure in the downswing we want that weight shift to the left, as we talk about, and a lot of push from that left leg against the ground that lifts especially the left side of the pelvis, and that is going to create also this torque that's going to create downswing rotation. In fact, if we did the opposite, if we unload the right side or the lead side and add trail side force, that's actually what creates the backswing. So it's creating rotational acceleration in the opposite direction. So I'll pause there on this. Phil, anything else you want me to talk about other than the key to? All right.
That was good. I mean, the only other point was that this is captured, these motions are captured by a multi-camera system inside the lab, correct?
Yes, these swings were, yes.
All right, so can you unshare your screen and I will share mine again?
Yeah.
Thank you. And now I'll share mine. Okay, so we're back and now we're going to talk about pelvis sway. And one of the things Mike mentioned quickly was that we need to shift our weight. And so here we can look at pelvis sway at multiple locations in the swing. So each one of these numbers is, as I said before, is an indicator or key performance indicator. And so we can look at the whole trend or the whole signature, and we can pull out key values at key points. So we see typically that the pelvis will shift away from the target, down here in negative is away, and up here in positive is toward the target. And remember, sway is from side to side. And so one of the key things we see in pelvis sway is that the pelvis starts to sway back towards the target before the top of backswing, not at the top of backswing. And so by the time we get to top of backswing, we are already moving towards the target significantly. So top of backswing, you'll see the men are already 0.3 of an inch more towards the target than they were at address. And the women are only about 1/10. So you can think in your mind that by the time you get to top of backswing, you basically are going to be at the same location with your pelvis that you were at address. Now, by the time you get to impact, however, we have shifted significantly over to the leads. Sorry, hey, I'm getting it wrong. Let me go back to the curve. And that's a really good example of what happens when you get your terminology mixed up towards and away. So at impact, we are actually, as I was saying earlier, we're moving towards the target. I think I misspoke again, but anyway, now I'm back on track. We're 4.3 towards the target and 3.1 for the women. So you'll see that we move continuously towards the target. And it's actually, there's actually a small deviation right here. So we have kind of a stabilize. That's, if you know anything about the kinematic sequence, that's where we start to decelerate the pelvis rotation speed. And so you see a little bit of a stabilization there as well. The key factor here that I want to put forward is that 100% of the males and 100% of the females in our tour database move towards the target before the top of backswing. Now that was kind of a standard one. Let's look at, hang on, let me get the button in the right place again. Let's look at variations. So a typical error is a hangback. And so you can see the variation curve here. So they're moving away from the target to start with. They start to move towards the target, but then they just stop moving towards the target and hang back. And then move on to finish afterwards because they like to get into a nice finish position, but it's kind of a false finish because they didn't get across at impact. And so another variation we have is what we call a slider, a person who slides towards the target. They'll move towards the target very, very early and then keep moving very rapidly towards the target and not have any stabilization or at or around impact. So, for example, we can look at the difference between the backswing and impact, and we can see how much sway slide, in this case, slide towards the target, we've gotten, and that's for the men, it's about 4.3. I'm sorry, 5.3, because it's the difference between these two. So we get 5.3 towards, and the women we get 4.2 towards. So it's kind of interesting. The women tend to hang back a little bit more than the men do. And that's what we're seeing in our database. So with those numbers and ideas in mind that we want to be able to shift towards the target, how do we do that? So let's me give the screen back to Dr. Mike, and he can talk about the forces that create that slide, the sway and the slide.
Okay, so I actually want to start with a different question, and if I'm used to classrooms where I ask a question, and I was one of the few teachers that actually expected an answer. We won't do that here since everybody's on mute. But the question here is why do we want that pelvis slide? What is, not to bring up any one person, but what's the potential problem in the swing with hanging back? And there's one, well, there are two real reasons. One is you want to be in a good, strong position to deliver the club at impact. But the really big one is something else. And the goal is to add speed in the downswing. And we've got some good numbers on this. There are people that think, okay, well, that means I should just throw my hips as fast as I can toward the target and create a lot of linear speed. And that's actually not the way this works. Pelvis speed toward the target tops out at like 2 or 3 miles an hour, and it's not attached to the club. So you can't just you can't, pun intended, translate that linear pelvis speed into club head speed. It's the process of making it so to show you how that works. So if we want the body to move toward the target, toward the lead side, then we need to create acceleration that way. We need this yellow arrow to tilt toward the target. And it varies a little bit based on swing style, but in the last quarter of backswing, typically what we'll see is with the trail foot, the golfer is starting to push sideways. So that is what's going to start creating the slide toward the target. And like Phil mentioned, this happens before top of the backswing. If it doesn't start until after that, it's too late to really do a good job here. So it's this key point here in the backswing where the golfer starts pushing toward the target. So that's what creates literally the slide or sway toward the target. If you notice, what this did again is it moved that yellow arrow away from the center of mass. And so again, that's what creates torque. We don't want to try to hold the wrench right there next to the bolt and try to push there. We want to push all the way out toward the end of the handle of a wrench. So we want to get that yellow arrow away from the center of mass. That's what's going to create more rotational acceleration. So the great gift, the big benefit of having that slide toward the target, that pelvis sway toward the target, is that means that the golfer pushed sideways. That gets that yellow arrow away from the center of the body, and that's what creates torque to create speed, the downswing. Phil, anything you want to jump in on there? Oh, and you're still muted. I set you up for failure.
That's okay. I do that all the time. Still haven't got this getting unmuted. All right, and you've given me my screen back?
Yep.
So I'll share screen again. And let's go ahead. Number 3. Okay, so now we're going to get into pelvis thrust, and we're going to look at turn, and we're going to look at turn speed, and then Mike's going to relate those to the ground forces and torques. So pelvis thrust, let me get a pen again. Let's see how we're doing for time. Oh, we're not doing too bad. I think we're going to be okay. So I'll get my laser pointer. Here we go. Again, we're looking at signature of motion here. So this is the signature of the pelvic thrust throughout the entire swing. Starts out pretty stable, but then starts to move forward. Up is forward, and down below the black line is backward. So your pelvis, by the time you get to the top of backswing in an elite swing, is moved forward a little bit. Notice it's way less than an inch, so it's not moving much. Let's see, top here says an inch, yeah, okay. And then this one is, this is an average of 94 players, by the way. And this is just one example here. So these numbers don't match perfectly, but it's the shape that I'm interested in showing you. So on the downswing, the pelvis pushes backwards. So you've all heard about the drill where you put the chair or some cardboard box behind you and you try to push that away with your butt. Well, this is exactly what's happening. You see that the pelvis is moving away from the target, pushing backwards. And then in the middle of the downswing, it starts to move again towards the ball. Thrust is, by the way, I should define, and you can see the arrow, thrust is toward and away from the ball. So forward and backward as far as your body is concerned. So now by impact, we're moving forward towards the ball, and that happens more and more all the way through impact. So let's see, what are some common faults here? Well, standing up at the top of backswing and early extension, that would be projecting the pelvis much, much further forward. In fact, if I take it to the next screen, I've got examples of these two variations that we see. This variation is very similar to the one I was showing you on the previous screen, except in this case, they actually go negative, which means they go way further back than the typical example. The typical example that I showed you before only got back to where they were at address, so only got back to 0. This one, they're thrusting backwards. So this is the sit back. Now this one's the early extension where you're forward thrusting the pelvis significantly. So the thrust in this case, typically by a novice golfer, and they're going to be steep and over the top probably, is that they're pushing the pelvis forward all the way from takeaway all the way through to the follow through. So that's a typical fault there. Okay, so that's pelvic thrust, and Mike will relate that to the forces. Now we'll talk about pelvic turn and then pelvic turn speed or pelvic turn velocity. As far as pelvis turn, it's very simple. You start out with your pelvis, slightly open, pretty darn square actually, but just a fraction open, 2 degrees for the men, 1 degree for the women. And then of course you close and you turn in the backswing. And again, here you transition, just like we did with the sway, you transition in terms of turning before the top of backswing. So obviously we want our pelvis to turn before our chest, but we're looking just at the pelvis here. So it turns before the top of backswing and is already turning into the downswing when the club turns around. And by the way, the definition of top, as far as we're concerned, is when the club turns around from backswing to downswing. And so then the pelvis turns rapidly, and you can see that it's turning rapidly because that slope is very steep. And then at impact, it's open. It's interesting that if you look at the difference between top and impact, it's very similar for the pelvis. So for the men, it's 45 degrees at the top, 41 degrees open at impact. For the women, it's 48 and 52. So basically, you turn back in the backswing almost or about the same as you turn at impact. Typically, women have a little bit more turn than men. And that slight dip there is because of the deceleration from the kinematic sequence, which I'm going to talk about now. So those are some numbers for pelvic turn. Let's look at the kinematic sequence and pelvic turn velocity. So I've got the pelvic turn velocity shown here, just in the downswing, and it's part of the entire kinematic sequence. So the pelvis is the first one that turns. As I said, you can see it just red just above there, which means the pelvis turns around in the downswing first, and it accelerates, carrying the rest of the body with it. And it reaches its peak maximum about lead arm parallel, which is kind of surprising when you think about it. That's pretty early. Lead arm parallel, then it starts to decelerate. And of course, it transfers the speed to the chest, to the arm, and to the club eventually. So the kinematic sequence basically is a method that you use that efficiently, if done correctly, efficiently transfers energy from the ground to the pelvis, to the chest, to the arm, and to the club. And not only transfers energy, but each joint has the ability to add speed. And so we can look at these speeds and we can get an idea of where the weak link might be, and how you're not performing correctly with a particular part of your body. And that the muscles between the pelvis and the chest could be, are related to this gain in speed from here to here. The shoulder muscles are the gain in speed from the peak of the green curve to the peak of the blue curve. And finally, your wrist release, the wrist set angle release, is the reason for the gain in the speed from the blue to the brown. So Sportsbox measures each of these maximum speeds and allows us to get the speed gains from one segment to the next. And of course, a really good pelvis speed is important to clubhead speed, and it is correlated with clubhead speed as well. So that is it. And I need to pass it over again to Mike to explain how those are related, how those motions and forces interact with each other. Okay, Mike, you're on.
Yep. All right. So that closing graph that Phil had up there was great. We've got the ground, and that the legs can use that, and they really drive the hips to the pelvis, and then the torso can rotate on top of that. And I'm going to use very generic terms. If somebody has very poor, very slow pelvis rotation, that means that any of that speed that isn't being generated down below, that the torso and the arms have to come up somehow with creating that extra speed, and that is a very difficult thing for the human body to do. If you remember back to the guy in outer space, it's tough to create a lot of velocity, and bad things happen when you can't actually use the ground. So pelvis rotation, especially pelvis rotation speed, is truly a key component for the good golf swing. So we'll talk about where that comes from, and then combine in the thrust and the rotation. So I've been showing this view primarily of the golf swing, and talked a little bit about why, as you can see here, the increase in lead side vertical force helps create rotation here. You'll notice here the golfer's pushing very nicely sideways with the trail leg, so that also creates more torque, more rotational velocity. But those two work in this view, in this plane. So if you had a very, very steep swing, so to speak, or if you were somehow trying to swing with your back against a fence or a wall and had a super vertical swing, that's the rotation we'd be creating from these two combinations, or the combination of these two forces. Trail side push sideways, and then lead side push up. But the body also rotates parallel to the ground in the transverse, or just the horizontal plane. And what I want to make sure people recognize is that we're not just pushing one direction. We're not even just pushing two directions. We're pushing in all three. And you can see here that, and this is probably the best reason why I like using ground reaction forces. This person is pushing downward and toward the back during the swing. So if there were no ground there, or if, let's say this person's in a lot of sand, somehow they found that, that can move, you'd actually see the trail foot, it would slide backward away from the ball. But because we have good ground force or good ground contact here, the ground reaction force shows us what direction the golfer is trying to move. So this arrow right here, this push from the trail leg, means that he is trying to rotate, right, trying to push the right hip, the trail hip forward. And you can see the lead foot arrow is pointing toward the back. So that means that he is trying to rotate or push the left hip backward. So that's what creates the horizontal rotation in the body. My favorite view for looking at this is actually an overhead view. So I'm going to center this a little bit. I'm going to zoom in. And for now, I'm actually going to turn off the body and just put the golf club in there. And I'm coming back to, let's get right there. So think of this, we talked about that wrench idea previously where you could only push on one side, you could only get the yellow arrow to one side. In this case, we can push, on this screen, it'll be push up with one and push backwards. So we can actually use both sides of what we call the wrench to create this rotation. And you're going to see how that happens in here. So in the backswing, we want rotation that direction. So we want rotation this way, and you can see in this case, the trail foot is pushing the right hip back or the trail hip back, and the lead foot is pushing the left hip or lead hip forward. So that works to close the pelvis, which Phil was talking about as the classic pattern in the back of the swing. It also helps to swing the club around and things like that. Now, as far as thrust, for that, we're going to see what direction the combined arrow is pointing. If it's pointing toward the ball, that's going to make the pelvis thrust toward the ball. If it's pointing away from the ball, then that is going to create negative thrust or keep the hips back against the wall in that drill, that kind of thing. So we'll notice backswing, relatively small forces. We don't need a lot of backswing velocity. And then you can see those arrows will start to shift. And so we're still in the backswing. You can still see that club going back, but you can see now that right arrow is pointing more forward. That left arrow, that lead arrow is pointing back. So what that's doing is starting to create the downswing rotational velocity, the pelvis opening velocity. Initially what it does is it slows the rotation, and then it just continues on, and you see a great shot right here. So this is doing a really good job of creating pelvis rotation. This player has a lot of speed and does a very nice job of it. So we want this combination of right foot pushing the right hip forward and left hip pushing the left hip back. So that's what we want. That's the purpose for the front to back forces. The thing we have to be careful about, as Phil was talking about, is that pelvis thrust. A little bit of movement toward the ball or a little bit of movement away from the ball typically keeps someone still in a good position to deliver the club and create good speed. But someone who tries to do, problem typically is when we have somebody who tries to only use one foot for this. Let's say somebody is really trail foot dominant. So we see this nice big arrow here, but the left side force isn't big enough. Then all of a sudden this arrow, instead of pointing back, meaning it'll keep the pelvis away from the ball, it continues to drift toward, and I'll tell you why. So everyone starts this push, this rotation of the pelvis, primarily on the trail side. And you can see here, the arrow is moving a little bit, is pointing a little bit up toward the ball. So that right there is going to try to create some pelvis thrust. That's going to try to move the body toward the ball. So I've lost my, here we go. So in a good swing, what we have is it starts with the trail side, and then the lead side takes over, and we get this good push away. Just on the thrust example that Phil showed, there might be a little bit of movement toward, but then there's a movement away from the ball during downswing. That's what we're hoping for. The problem is when that arrow doesn't push back enough, then we end up with more thrust toward the ball, which is a linear movement that we don't particularly want. It also means that person isn't using the lead side, the left foot, to create good pelvis rotation. So again, players who end up with a lot of thrust tend to not have very good pelvis rotation. And the reason why is that they're trying to only use one side and not the other. And in this view, that's a tougher way to create rotational velocity. So I'll do a quick summary here, and I'll start actually with this view. So for thrust and velocity, we want to manipulate, we want to use right foot pushing the right hip forward, left foot pushing back, and we can adjust how much of each we use to make sure there's not too much thrust toward or even away from the ball, although that's a less common example of we'll say swing errors or problems in the swing. For pelvis slide, we want that, especially that trail foot, pushing that arrow toward the target. That is going to help create the downswing rotational velocity. It'll also help, that's what the visual indicator there is, that we see the pelvis in the center of the body moving toward the target. The important factor there is that you're pushing sideways and creating good downswing velocity here. And then later in the swing, for vertical force, we want a lot of vertical force on the lead side. We don't want very much on the trail side. The vertical force is what's going to lift the pelvis. And if the person's doing it right and doing it mostly on the lead side rather than the trail side, then again, that helps create that torque, that helps create that downswing rotational velocity. So that's the quick summary of those three movements, the linear part that we can see, and what we hope the forces are doing correctly to create the rotational velocity we want along the way. So I'll pause there. Phil, you're welcome to take over from here.
Yeah, I think at this point, Will, if you can unshare your screen, we'll pass it back to Paul. And Paul, you can field a few questions. We've got a couple of minutes left, and maybe we'll take a couple of questions.
Yeah, so Phil, this one was for you. They were asking the ranges that you were showing during your presentation, if those were taken from the AMM database or through Sportsbox.
Those were initially from the AMM database, but we have, and we're substituting very quickly Sportsbox data. You'll be seeing it switch over to Sportsbox data, but we've already found that the ranges are very close to one another.
Any more questions? Drop it in the chat.
While they're waiting for him, Phil, do you want to talk through the how to see these on the app and share your screen?
Yeah, I mean, if we've got no questions, we've got another minute left or so, and I'll see if we can share it on my phone here. So let's see, share the screen. Here we go. Screen. Broadcast.
Looks good. Well, it looks like a Zoom broadcast, but
Hang on. 1 minute. I'm still a novice at doing this stuff. There we go. That's what I need. All right. So I've already set up the screen, and we can see if I, wrong. If I scroll to the right-hand side, we see we've got the trackers. So we can bring up and we can set the screen so we have pelvis lift, pelvis sway, pelvis turn, and we can see their trackers because they change their value throughout the entire swing. All right, but if we want to just know specific values at specific instances in time, just like we've talked about in our presentation today, then we can set those up as well. So here I've got indicators, and they're indicating this golfer is a college player, a decent golfer, and his pelvis lift is 2.6 into impact, and pelvis sway at the top is about 1.4. Generally, it's 1 inch, so he's a little bit too much sway in the backswing. Pelvis sway into impact is pretty decent. Oh, by the way, I forgot to show you this. I think Paul showed it. If I want to go and see what the floor ranges are at the different points, I can press on the tracker, and we can see at impact he is 3.8, and the ranges go from about 3 to 6. So we can check to see whether he's inside the range or right on the edge of the range. But then we can go back to the tracker, the indicators here, and we can also look at turn. We can see what I said, it's 40 degrees in the backswing and about 40 degrees in the downswing, and he's pretty close to that. He's a little bit more open, 46 degrees. And then I mentioned we have the pelvis turn speed maximums from the kinematic sequence. So we've got pelvis turn maximum, we've got chest turn maximum. He's got 500, which is decent. He's got almost 700, which is decent. And these are in degrees per second. Lead upper arm is about almost 1,000. There's forearm speed as well, which is a newbie. We've added that in. And then finally the shaft speed at 2241. Very good. So he's got decent speed values all the way through.
So Phil, sorry to interrupt, but we have one last question here.
I'll
Ryan, maybe
turn this off.
you can answer this one. If you have a player who slides pelvis to the target, say 8 or so inches of positive sway towards target, what do they need to do in their mechanics to reduce the pelvis sway towards the target?
Yeah, there could be a few different things that they're doing. So them just swaying 8 inches probably isn't enough information for me to be able to tell you like exactly how you could go about solving it. Something that I always try to keep top of mind when we're looking at the sway numbers is, where was their sway at the top of the backswing? Because you might have somebody that sways 2 inches towards the target and then they sway 8 inches at impact. So in total, they move that 6 inches. You could have somebody who swayed 2 inches off and then in total would be swaying roughly, 8, 9, 10 inches at that point. So those problems are usually two different things. So yeah, we need a little bit more information. There's a lot of different drills that you can do to help improve sway. But it's always tough to answer those like specific questions. Feel free if you want to email me the swing. I would love to provide some feedback that way.
Great. Well, I believe we are out of time here. Let's see. Maybe we can just do one more. Let's see. What would be the ideal amount of push or lowering of the pelvis in order to get a good lift in terms of a full swing, not only with the driver, but with irons too?
I can address that one, I guess. If I can go back to pelvis lift. So typically, top of backswing, we've dropped about 1 inch. Downswing max is about 1.2 inches. So not that much, but enough to be able to drop and raise. And that was from the tour database. For men and women, we're just about the same.
Phil, do you mind if I add a little bit there?
Not at all.
So the different swing styles, we'll see pretty substantial differences between the amount of pelvis lift and especially the pelvis sway toward the target. So Phil's database is tour level players, which is fantastic. And he made a great comment that I hope people were paying attention to. There are ways to use that drop, that descent, the pelvis lowering to add a little bit of power, but the real key is that vertical force and the lift phase. So for most players, well, the reason for the drop is to make sure there's enough room so the pelvis can lift up and they can still be in good posture, good position to deliver the club at impact. Since I've spent a fair amount of time with ground reaction forces, the squat and spring style that we're showing on here is great for people that can use it. It's a pretty athletic move, and the timing needs to be quite good. For folks that are maybe a little slower, smoother movers, I'll try to politely say, call them that way. A different option that I've seen used a lot is that they start with a lower pelvis, so a little more knee flex. And so that player wouldn't necessarily show the drop during the backswing because he or she is already in position. So there's plenty of room to have the ascent to lift. So the amount of lower varies a little bit on the style of player. On the tour level, we're like Phil said, we're going to see drop and lift, and it's going to be a little bit bigger than average. But if we're talking about more recreational players, we're probably going to see a little bit less drop because that drop and lift has to be a pretty quick move. Hopefully that
Great.
makes sense.
Great. Well, I'm going to wrap things up here. We are a little over time here, but Dr. Phil and Dr. Mike, thank you so much for your time today. This was, I hope this was as valuable as it was to me, to everyone else. Again, thank you so much. And for all of you that would like more information on the app or subscription, please contact Edwin, our director of sales, at the email on the screen. But hope everyone has a great rest of the day, and hopefully see you guys in our next webinar.
Thanks for letting me join.
Great. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.